They buried her husband on the hottest day of summer, and 3 days later, the bank sent a letter. $200, 30 days. A widow with $15 to her name and a 3-month secret growing in her belly. A baby her husband died never knowing about. Then a stranger walks into a church and offers her a deal. Marry him, and the debt disappears. He doesn't want love. He wants a partner. She doesn't want promises. She wants survival. So she says yes to a man she's met exactly twice. And on their wedding night, he sleeps on the far edge of the bed like she's made of glass. But here's what he didn't tell her. Buried in the fine print of her dead husband's loan is a clause that could take everything. And this cowboy knew about it before he ever proposed. The man who made no lies his only rule, built their entire marriage on one. And the letter she found hidden in her first husband's coat, signed with a single initial, E, the same initial that belongs to the daughter of the most dangerous man in town. This is Cowboy Dusk Channel, where love is forged in dust and firelight, and every story carries the weight of the frontier and the heartbeat of those brave enough to call it home. This story reminds us that family isn't what you're born into. It's what you choose to build when everything else has been taken away, and that the bravest thing a broken man can do isn't fight. It's let someone close enough to see every scar and stay anyway. If that hook grabbed you, the full story is going to stay with you for days. Smash that like button. Drop a comment. Would you have married a stranger to save your child's future? Share this with someone who believes love isn't about perfection, but about choosing to stay. And hit subscribe with the bell so you never miss a story when the sun goes down.
They buried Thomas Lancaster on the hottest day of the summer, and the ground was so dry the gravediggers had to pour water into the hole before they could get the coffin to settle. 3 days later, the bank sent a letter, as if death had not already taken everything. Clara Lancaster stood at the edge of the grave long after the last mourner had shuffled away. The July sun beat down on Fort Yuma without mercy, turning the earth to pale dust and the sky to a sheet of hammered brass. She kept one hand pressed to her belly where a 3-month secret grew, a secret Thomas had died not knowing, and with the other she held the brim of her bonnet against a hot wind that smelled of sage and something burnt. The town behind her was not much to speak of. A handful of sun-bleached buildings clinging to the edge of the Colorado River, like they were afraid to let go. A general store, a church, a saloon, the Cray Valley Bank with its painted sign already peeling in the heat. Fort Yuma was the kind of place that chewed people up and spit out their bones. And it did not much care whether you were ready for it or not. Thomas had not been ready. Clara turned from the grave and walked back to the one-room house on the outskirts of town that she and Thomas had called home for 2 years. The door stuck in the frame the way it always did, and she had to put her shoulder into it the way Thomas used to, and the memory of that small, shared gesture hit her so hard she had to stop in the doorway and breathe until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to let her move. Inside, the heat was worse. The single window let in a square of white light that fell across the table where Thomas had eaten his last breakfast, where he had kissed her forehead and told her he would be back by noon, where his coffee cup still sat because Clara could not bring herself to wash it. She sat down at that table and opened the letter from the Cray Valley Bank. Thomas had owed $200, secured against the homestead, due in 30 days. The words were neat and small and polite, in the way that money men were always polite when they were about to take everything you had. Clara read the letter twice, then set it down and stared at the wall. She had $15 to her name, a trunk of clothes, Thomas's old rifle hanging above the door, and a baby coming in 6 months that would need food and shelter, and a world that did not look like this one. Clara pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. She was 22 years old. She had already buried her parents, both taken by fever in the same Missouri winter. She had married a kind man who worked himself half to death trying to make the desert bloom and then got the rest of the way killed by a spooked horse that threw him against the barn wall and broke his neck in an instant. She had learned a long time ago that the world did not owe you a warning before it took things from you. It just took them. But knowing that did not make the letter any easier to read. She spent the rest of the afternoon going through Thomas's papers, looking for anything that might help. What she found instead made things worse. Thomas had been a good man, but a poor businessman. He had taken Silas Cray's loan to buy seed and irrigation equipment, and when the crops failed in the first season, he could not repay. Clara found a note in Thomas's handwriting tucked between two receipts. It said simply, "Cray wants the water. I will not sell." Beside it was a letter from the bank offering to purchase the homestead at a quarter of its value. Thomas had refused. And now Thomas was dead, and the bank wanted its money, and Clara did not have it. She was about to close the papers into a stack when something else caught her eye. A second letter, this one hidden inside the lining of Thomas's good coat, the coat he wore to church, the coat she had pressed her face into the night they told her he was gone, breathing in the smell of him. The letter was written in a woman's hand. The penmanship was elegant, educated, nothing like the rough script of the frontier wives Clara knew. The words were intimate. "I think of you more than I should. When will you come to town again?" It was signed with a single initial, E. Clara read it 3 times. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes did not fill. Something inside her simply went cold, the way a fire goes cold when you pour sand on it. Not out, not yet, but smothered down to something that could not warm anything. Thomas. Her gentle, quiet, hard-working Thomas. The man whose child she carried. The man she had mourned with honest grief. He had carried this letter next to his heart, hidden in the lining of his Sunday coat, and he had never said a word. She did not know who E was. She did not know if it mattered. Thomas was dead, and the dead kept their secrets better than the living ever could. But the doubt settled into her chest like a stone, and she knew it would stay there. Clara held the letter over the lamp flame and watched it curl and blacken. Then she dropped the ash on the floor and immediately wished she had not burned it. Evidence, her father would have said. Never destroy evidence until you know what it means. But it was too late. The letter was gone, and the doubt remained, and Clara added it to the list of things she could not fix. That evening, as the sun finally began to lose its grip on the sky, a knock came at the door. Clara opened it, expecting another covered dish from another pitying neighbor. Instead, she found Martha Green, the pastor's wife, standing on the step with empty hands and a look on her face that Clara had never seen before. It was the look of a woman about to say something she had thought about very carefully. Martha was a round, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had appointed herself the moral compass of Fort Yuma. She knew everyone's business, dispensed advice whether you wanted it or not, and had a heart as big as the desert sky, even if her tongue could cut like a fence wire. "Clara, dear," Martha said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She closed the door behind her and turned to face Clara with those knowing eyes. "I am not here to bring you stew." Clara almost smiled. "That makes you the first person today." Martha did not smile back. "Sit down, child. I have something to talk to you about, and you are going to want to be sitting when you hear it." Clara sat. Martha settled across from her at the table and folded her hands. "You know your situation," Martha said. "I will not insult you by pretending it is anything other than dire. The bank will take this house. You have no family nearby. You are carrying a child. And Fort Yuma is not the kind of town that offers many opportunities to a woman in your position." Clara waited. She had learned that Martha got to her point in her own time, and pushing only made her take longer. "There is a man," Martha said, and the way she said it, careful, like handling a loaded gun, told Clara this conversation was going to change everything one way or another. "His name is Jacob Quinn. He owns a ranch about 5 miles north of town. 200 acres, cattle, horses. His mother passed last winter, and he has been on his own since. He came to my husband last week asking if we knew of any suitable women who might be willing to enter into a practical marriage." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Clara opened her mouth and closed it again. a practical marriage. I know how it sounds, Martha said firmly, and I would not suggest it if I saw another way. But you need security, and he needs a partner, and sometimes the Lord works through practical arrangements as much as through grand romance. I mentioned your name, I did not mention your condition. That is your business to share as you see fit. Clara stared at the table, the wood grain blurred and sharpened. Her mind raced through the options she had already counted 100 times. Find work as a laundress, a cook maybe, until her belly grew too large and no one would hire her. Try to scrape together passage money to her aunt in St. Louis, a woman she had not spoken to in 4 years and who might not open the door. Or sit here and wait for the bank to put her out on the road with a trunk and a rifle and a baby on the way. Or marry a stranger. What kind of man is he? Clara asked quietly. Martha considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Honest, hard-working, a bit rough around the edges as most of these cattlemen are. He served in the border campaigns, came back and built that ranch up from nothing with his mother beside him. He does not drink to excess. He does not fight without cause. He is not cruel. I have never heard a bad word spoken against him. Martha paused. He is not looking for a love match, Clara. He is looking for someone to build with, and I think that might suit your situation better than you expect. Clara closed her eyes. She thought about the baby, the innocent life that depended on her making the right choice. That child deserved a roof, food, safety, all the things she could not provide alone. When does he want to meet? She heard herself ask. Martha's face showed relief, though she tried to hide it. He could come to town tomorrow. You could meet at the church with my husband and me present. Just a conversation, no promises. Clara nodded slowly. Tomorrow, then. After Martha left, Clara sat alone in the gathering dark and tried to imagine what this Jacob Quinn might look like. What kind of man offered marriage to a stranger? What kind of life waited 5 miles north of town on a ranch she had never seen? She did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Thomas and stared at the ceiling and tried not to feel like she was betraying a dead man who might have betrayed her first. The letter from E burned in her memory, even though the paper itself was ash. Clara had imagined a weathered old cowboy with cold eyes and cracked hands. The man standing in the church was none of those things, and that scared her more than if he had been. She dressed in her best black dress that morning, pinned up her hair, and walked to the church under a sky that was already white with heat. Her hands shook the whole way. She kept them fisted in her skirts so no one would see. The church was a small wooden building with a cross on top that leaned slightly east, as if even God's house was trying to get out of the sun. Inside it was cooler, though not by much. Pastor Green and Martha were waiting near the front, and with them stood a tall man in clean work clothes and a dark hat. Jacob Quinn turned as she entered, and Clara felt her breath catch in her chest like a fishhook. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard-built frame of a man who worked every day of his life and did not sit down much while doing it. His face was tanned deep from years in the sun, and his jaw was strong, and his hair was dark and needed cutting. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Blue-green, the color of deep water in shade, and they studied her not with pity or hunger, but with a kind of frank, steady assessment, like a man evaluating whether a horse had heart enough for the long ride ahead. There was a scar on his left forearm, long and ragged, visible where he had rolled up his sleeves against the heat. He was younger than she had expected, 27 at most. And handsome, she realized with a surprise that annoyed her, in an unpolished, rough-cut way that had nothing to do with pretty and everything to do with solid. He removed his hat as she approached. His hands were large, calloused, and careful in their movements. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, the kind of voice you had to lean into to hear. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Mr. Quinn, the pleasure is mine." Pastor Green cleared his throat and suggested they sit and talk, and he and Martha moved to a pew several rows away. Close enough for propriety, far enough for honesty. Clara sat. Jacob settled beside her, keeping a respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara studied her hands folded in her lap and wondered how you started a conversation like this. How you interviewed a man for the job of being your husband. Jacob started for her. Mrs. Green probably told you what I'm looking for. I want to be straight with you about what I'm offering and what I would expect. Clara appreciated his directness. She looked up at him and nodded. I appreciate honesty. I have a ranch about 5 miles north, 200 acres, maybe 50 head of cattle. Some horses I am starting to breed for sale. The house has 4 rooms. It is nothing fancy, but it is solid. I do well enough to provide for a family, but I am not rich. The work is hard, and the life is not easy. I am not afraid of hard work, Clara said. Jacob nodded. I did not figure you were. Mrs. Green said you fell on hard times after your husband passed. I am sorry for your loss. The sympathy in his voice sounded genuine, and Clara felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away. Thank you. It has been difficult. I imagine so. He turned his hat slowly in his hands, round and round. I am not looking to replace your husband or rush you into anything you're not ready for. What I need is a partner, someone to help run the household, yes, but also someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. Hired hands do not do that. I need someone who will. Clara studied him. The hat turning in his hands was the only sign of nerves. What do you expect from a wife that you would not expect from a hired hand, she asked. Jacob paused. That flicker again, surprise and something that looked like respect. I just told you, a partner, someone who talks back. Clara almost smiled. Almost. This was the moment. She knew it, and her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. If she did not tell him now, and he found out later, whatever they built would be built on a lie. And she had already had enough of lies hidden in coat linings. Mr. Quinn, she said slowly, there is something you should know before we go any further. He turned those blue-green eyes on her, waiting, not impatient, just steady. Clara took a breath that went all the way down to her boots. I am with child, about 3 months along. My husband died before I could tell him. I understand if this changes your mind about your offer, but you deserve to know the truth before making any decisions. She watched his face. She had braced herself for disgust, rejection, maybe pity if she was lucky. What she got was none of those. Jacob went very still. His hands stopped turning the hat. His jaw worked once, then again. Then he stood up. Excuse me a moment, he said, and he walked out of the church. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed off the walls like a gunshot. Clara sat in the pew with her hands gripping the wood so hard her knuckles went white, and felt her last hope walk out into the July heat. 5 minutes passed. The longest 5 minutes of her life. Martha started to stand, her face worried. But the church door opened and Jacob walked back in. He sat down beside Clara, hat in his hands. And he did not look at her right away. I needed a minute, he said, not because of the baby, because I wanted to say yes too fast. And I do not trust decisions I make that quick. Clara stared at him. She could not find words. He turned to face her. I will think on it overnight. But I want you to know something, regardless of what I decide about the marriage. I will help you settle that bank debt. No woman carrying a child should be put out on the street. That is not how things ought to work. Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks before she could stop them. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. You do not even know me. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. I know enough, he said. Then he put his hat on, nodded to the Greens, and walked out of the church for the second time. Clara watched him go and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Either he was the best man she had ever met, or he wanted something she could not yet see. In her experience, men who seemed too good to be true usually were. But then again, Thomas had seemed perfectly ordinary, and Thomas had carried secrets in his coat lining. Maybe she was no judge of men at all. She did not sleep that night either. Jacob came at dawn, an hour earlier than they had agreed. He brought a ring, simple gold, worn smooth. and a single condition that would come back to haunt them both. Clara was already awake when the knock came. She had been sitting at the table in her nightgown, staring at the wall, running the numbers again in her head the way she had done all night. $15, 30 days, a baby in 6 months. The math never changed no matter how many times she counted. She opened the door, and Jacob was standing there in the early light with his hat in one hand and a small cloth pouch in the other. He looked like he had not slept either. There were shadows under his eyes and dust on his boots from the ride in, and his jaw was set in a way that told Clara he had made a decision and was not going to unmake it. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. He sat at the table, the same chair Thomas used to sit in, and Clara tried not to think about that. She sat across from him and waited. "I thought about it all night," Jacob said, "and I would like to marry you, if you are willing. The baby does not change my offer. If anything, it makes the offer more important. A child needs a home, and I can provide one." Clara felt the tightness in her chest loosen by one small degree. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you take on another man's child for a woman you have met once?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I know what it is like to grow up without a father. My mother raised me alone. I saw what that cost her. If I can keep that from happening to someone else, it seems like the right thing to do." There was something in his voice when he said it, something heavy and unfinished, that Clara did not understand yet. But she filed it away the way she filed away all the things about Jacob Quinn that did not quite add up. The scar on his arm, the way his eyes went flat when he was thinking hard, the way he controlled every word that came out of his mouth like a man who did not trust what might escape if he stopped being careful. "I have one condition," Jacob said. He opened the cloth pouch and took out the ring, setting it on the table between them. It caught the early light. "No lies between us. Ever. If something is wrong, say it straight. If you are angry, tell me why. If you are scared, tell me what of. I can handle just about anything in this world except being deceived." Clara looked at the ring. She thought about the letter from E already burned to ash. She thought about the secrets Thomas had kept and the ones this man across the table might be keeping. And she nodded. "No lies," she said. Agreed. They worked out the terms with the same practical efficiency that two ranchers might use to negotiate a cattle sale. Jacob would pay off Thomas's debt immediately. He would bring his wagon to town on the wedding day to move Clara's belongings. The marriage would be legal and real, recognized by the church and the territory. Clara would be a full partner in the household, contributing whatever work she could. Jacob would provide for her and the child. Physical matters between them would proceed at whatever pace Clara set. "We go at whatever pace you need," Jacob said, his ears reddening slightly. "No exceptions. I will not pressure you about anything." Clara appreciated his directness even as it made her face heat. "We are both being very practical about this," she said. "Practical keeps people alive out here," Jacob replied. "Romance is a luxury. Partnership is a necessity." 3 days later, Clara stood in the church in a cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her alter and spoke vows to a man she had met exactly twice. Pastor Green presided. Martha stood witness with tears running freely down her round cheeks. 2 other members of the congregation sat in the back, more curious than supportive. Jacob wore his best shirt, clean and pressed, and a jacket that pulled slightly tight across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was combed back, still damp. He had shaved, and Clara could see the strong line of his jaw and the small nick on his chin where the razor had slipped. He was nervous. She could see it in the tension of his hands, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes kept finding hers as if checking whether she was still there. The ceremony was brief. Clara spoke her vows in a quiet voice, feeling the strangeness of promising to love and honor a man she barely knew, while the memory of her first husband was still fresh as a wound. But Jacob's voice was steady on his vows, steady and sure. And when he slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembled just slightly. And somehow that small trembling made her trust him more than all his steady words. Pastor Green pronounced them man and wife. Jacob leaned down and pressed a kiss to Clara's cheek. Not her lips, her cheek. Clara noticed that, and she would remember it for a long time. Outside the church, the July sun hit them like a wall. Clara blinked in the glare and was about to step toward the wagon when a voice stopped them both. "Well now, congratulations are in order." Silas Cray stood in the shade of the church awning like he had been waiting there all morning. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair combed back from a face that was handsome, in the way a rattlesnake was handsome, all smooth lines and cold attention. He wore a dark suit that must have cost more than most families in Fort Yuma earned in a year, and his smile did not reach his eyes. It never did. "Quinn," Silas said, extending his hand, "I hear you have taken on the Lancaster property along with the widow. Generous of you. If you ever find that land is more trouble than it is worth, my door is always open." Jacob's face went still. Not angry, not frightened, just closed off like shutters drawn tight against a storm. He did not take Silas's hand. "I do not sell land, Cray." Silas let his hand drop, still smiling. "Everyone says that, right up until the moment they do." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Quinn, I hope your new husband proves more fortunate than your last one." He walked away. Clara watched him go and felt something cold move through her gut. She looked up at Jacob and saw that his jaw was locked tight and a muscle was ticking in his cheek. "Who is he really?" Clara asked. "Not the banker. Who is he?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The man who wants my water. And he will do just about anything to get it." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands firm and steady on her waist. And for a moment, when her feet left the ground and his face was close to hers, Clara smelled leather and soap and something warm underneath. That was just him. And she felt a pull in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the fact that her husband, this stranger, was close enough to kiss, and she could feel the heat of his body through her dress. Then he set her down on the seat and stepped back, and the moment passed. The ride north took about an hour. The wagon rolled through open desert, and for the first time since Thomas died, Clara looked at the world around her and really saw it. Scrub brush and rocky outcroppings stretched to the horizon. Patches of dry grass waved in the hot wind where cattle grazed in the distance. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals without effort. The sky was so vast it made Clara feel like an ant on a dinner plate, and the land was harsh and unforgiving, but there was a stark, fierce beauty to it that stirred something in her she had not expected. Jacob pointed out landmarks as they rode: the mesa where he sometimes found arrowheads, the draw where flash floods came through in monsoon season, the ridge where a mountain lion had killed 2 of his calves last spring. He spoke in his usual quiet way, not filling silence for its own sake, but sharing information he thought she might need. Clara listened and filed it away. When they crested the last rise, Jacob pointed ahead. "That is the ranch." Clara followed his gaze and saw a collection of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A house, a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. Everything was well maintained, solid, built to last. And running through the middle of the property, catching the sun like a ribbon of silver, was a creek. Clear water, flowing steady. She looked at Jacob. "That is why he wants your land." Jacob nodded. "Only reliable water source in the valley. My mother picked this spot because of it. Cray has been trying to get his hands on it for years." A lean, red-haired man was waiting at the gate when they pulled up. He was grinning wide enough to show a missing tooth on the left side, and his hat was pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he had never taken anything in his life entirely seriously. "Boss," the man said, eyeing Clara with open curiosity, "I sent you to town for flour, and you come back with a wife. You always did overshop." Clara laughed. It came out of her without permission, surprising her, the first real laugh since Thomas died. It felt strange and good and slightly guilty all at the same time. "Clara, this is Red Buckley," Jacob said. "He works for me. Supposedly." Red swept his hat off and bowed with an exaggerated flourish. "Ma'am, welcome to the Quinn Ranch. If you need anything at all, you just holler. If the boss gives you any trouble, you holler louder. Jacob showed her through the house. 4 rooms, as promised. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace blackened from years of use, a sturdy table and chairs, and a cooking area that was basic but functional. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room. One had clearly been Jacob's mother's, with a faded quilt on the bed and dried flowers in a jar on the windowsill that had long since lost their color. The other was Jacob's, spare and neat, the bed made with military corners. The 4th room was smaller, more of a storage space, but Jacob said it could be made into a nursery when the time came. He said it casually, as if a nursery were no different from a feed room. But Clara caught the way his voice softened on the word, and she filed that away, too. "I have been sleeping in the larger room," Jacob said, his ears going red. "But I can move my things to the smaller one if you would prefer, or we can share. Whatever suits you. I meant what I said about no pressure." Clara looked at the bedroom. She looked at this man who was now her husband, this stranger who had paid her debts and given her his name, and blushed when he talked about sleeping arrangements. Thomas had never blushed in his life. "We are married," Clara said quietly. "We should share a room, but I would appreciate time on the other matters." "Of course." Jacob looked relieved. "Whatever pace you set." They spent the rest of the day settling Clara's belongings into the house. It did not take long. She had so little. Her clothes went into the dresser Jacob cleared for her. Her few kitchen things joined his in the cooking area. Her books, 3 worn volumes that were her most precious possessions, found a place on a shelf near the fireplace. That evening, Clara made dinner from Jacob's well-stocked pantry. Biscuits, beans, fried bacon. They sat across from each other at the table and ate. And Jacob told her about the ranch, the cattle, the horses, his plans to expand the herd. He was not chatty by nature, but he answered her questions thoroughly and seemed genuinely interested when she asked about the vegetable garden his mother had started. After dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the desert. The sky turned from brass to copper to a deep, glowing orange that set the mesas on fire. The air cooled by slow degrees, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and another answered. "It is a good spot," Clara said. "You have built something here." "My mother and I built it together," Jacob said. "She worked as hard as any man. I wish she could have seen it really start to pay off before she passed." "Tell me about her," Clara said. Jacob was quiet for a moment. She was tough. Had to be. But she was kind, too. Never let the hardness of life make her cruel. She taught me to read and write. Made sure I knew right from wrong. He paused. Then, quietly, "I think she would have liked you." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. "I hope so." When it was time for bed, they went inside together. Clara changed into her nightgown in the bedroom while Jacob banked the fire and checked the doors. When he came into the room, he had on a simple pair of trousers and a long shirt, and he climbed into bed from the far side with such exaggerated care that Clara almost smiled. They lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the mattress. The distance between them felt vast enough to hold the whole desert. In the darkness, Clara whispered, "Jacob, are you awake?" A pause. Then, "Yeah. Thank you. For everything." Another pause, longer this time. "Do not thank me yet," he said quietly. "We have not done the hard part." She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his voice told her she was not ready for the answer. So she closed her eyes and listened to him breathe and tried to believe that she had made the right choice. Outside, the desert settled into its nighttime sounds. The creek ran clear and steady through the property, whispering over stones. In the corral, a horse stomped once and was still. The stars came out in numbers that the sky over town could never match, thick and bright and ancient. Clara lay awake for a long time. So did Jacob. Neither of them said another word. The wild mare had nearly killed Red 3 times that week, and Jacob was ready to sell her to the slaughterhouse. That was when Clara stepped off the porch and into the corral, and everything Jacob thought he knew about his wife came apart like a frayed rope. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. Clara had settled into life on the ranch the way water settles into a dry creek bed, filling the spaces that needed filling, finding the low places, making itself necessary without making a fuss about it. She woke before dawn each morning to have breakfast ready when Jacob came in from the first round of chores. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and tended the vegetable garden that Jacob's mother had started. She had reorganized the pantry, patched a hole in the kitchen wall, and taught herself how to operate the temperamental cast-iron stove that seemed to have a personal grudge against anyone who was not Ruth Quinn. She was efficient. She was capable. She was exactly the partner Jacob had said he wanted, and they were failing completely as human beings. Every conversation between them stayed on the surface like a boat afraid to leave the shallows. They talked about cattle prices. They talked about whether the beans needed more water. They talked about the weather, which in Fort Yuma was almost always the same. Hot, dry. We'll probably be hot and dry again tomorrow. But every time a conversation drifted anywhere personal, Jacob found a reason to be somewhere else. A fence that needed checking, a horse that needed feeding. Something always needed doing, and Jacob always needed to do it right at the moment Clara tried to reach him. It was like being married to a very polite wall, she told Red one morning, when Jacob had excused himself from breakfast mid-sentence. Red leaned against the porch rail and grinned. "You should have seen him before you got here." He did not even have to be polite. Just wall. Clara did not find that as funny as Red did. The problem was not that Jacob was unkind. He was considerate in 100 small ways. He made sure she had everything she needed. He chopped extra firewood so she would not have to. He brought her a wildflower from the range one afternoon and left it on the kitchen table without a word. He checked on her constantly when she was outside, making sure she was not overdoing it in the heat. But he did not talk to her, not really, not the way a person talked to someone they were trying to build a life with. And Clara was beginning to understand that the wall around Jacob Quinn was not built to keep her out. It was built to keep something in. It was the horse that changed everything. Tempest was a wild Mustang mare that Jacob had captured from a herd running north of the property. Coal-black from nose to tail with a white blaze down her face like a bolt of lightning, she was the most beautiful horse Clara had ever seen, and the most dangerous animal on the ranch. She had thrown Red 3 times in 5 days. The first time he came away with a bruised ego. The second time he came away with a bruised hip. The third time he came away with a cracked rib and a vocabulary that would have made a mule skinner blush. Another ranch hand, a young fellow named Pete, took one look at Tempest after Red's third spill and quit on the spot. Said he had not signed up to get killed by a horse, and he walked off the property without collecting his last week's pay. Jacob was in the yard discussing the situation with Red when Clara came out of the house. She had been watching from the window, and she had seen what neither of them had. The horse was not mean. The horse was terrified. Every time someone entered the corral, Tempest's ears flattened, and her hindquarters angled toward the fence, ready to bolt. She showed the whites of her eyes. She pawed the ground not in challenge, but in panic. Clara knew the difference. Her father had taught her to read a horse the way most men read a newspaper, and this horse was screaming fear in every line of her body. "Let me try," Clara said. Both men turned to look at her. Jacob's face went through a quick series of expressions: surprise, confusion, concern, and landed on the one Clara was learning to recognize as his default: polite refusal. "Absolutely not," he said. "You are 3 months along. That horse has put a grown man on his back 3 times this week." Red, for his part, looked at Clara with his head tilted and said nothing. He was smarter than people gave him credit for. Clara felt something shift inside her. 3 weeks of being treated like a piece of delicate china. 3 weeks of doing dishes and pulling weeds and having polite conversations about nothing. 3 weeks of watching her husband disappear behind his wall every time she tried to reach him. Something snapped, quiet and clean, like a twig under a boot. "You married me because you needed a partner," she said, and her voice was level, but there was iron underneath it. Not another piece of furniture to set in the corner. If I wanted to sit still and be quiet, I could have done that without a husband. The silence that followed was electric. Red suddenly found something very interesting to study on the ground near his boots. Jacob stared at Clara with those blue-green eyes, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw something behind the wall. Not anger, not irritation. Something that looked almost like hunger. Like he had been waiting for someone to push back at him and had not known it. "My father was a horsebreaker in Missouri," Clara said, pressing her advantage. "Jeremiah Sutter. He worked with wild mustangs from the time he was 15 until he died. He taught me everything he knew. I grew up around horses like this one. I know what I am doing." Jacob looked at Tempest. The mare was pacing the far end of the corral, her black coat slick with nervous sweat. He looked back at Clara. His jaw worked. "If she pins her ears and turns her back end toward you, you get out of that corral," he said. No arguing. Clara nodded. She walked to the corral gate, lifted the latch, and stepped inside. The change was immediate. Tempest stopped pacing. Her head came up, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. She was reading Clara the same way Clara was reading her. Two female creatures sizing each other up across the dusty arena. Clara did not advance. She stood still, hands at her sides, empty. No rope, no whip, no halter. Just her voice. "Easy, girl," she said softly. "Easy now. Nobody is going to hurt you. I know you are scared. I know the world has been rough with you, but that is done now." She kept her voice low and steady, the same voice her father had used. The voice that said, "I am not a threat, and I am not leaving, and you can take all the time you need." She read the horse's body, the tension in the shoulders, the slight trembling in the legs, the way Tempest kept her weight on her back feet, ready to spin and run. This was a horse that had been chased, roped, thrown, and manhandled, and she had learned that humans meant pain. Unlearning that would take patience, not strength. Clara waited. 5 minutes. 10. The sun beat down and sweat ran between her shoulder blades and her calves ached from standing still. Tempest stood at the far end of the corral, watching. Her ears rotated forward and back. Forward. Back. At the 15-minute mark, Tempest took a step toward Clara. Clara did not move, did not reach out, did not even change her breathing. Tempest took another step, then another. The mare's head was low now, neck extended, nostrils working. She was curious. Underneath all the fear and the fight, she was curious. That was what Clara had been looking for. You could work with curiosity. You could not work with pure fear. After 20 minutes, Tempest stood 2 feet from Clara. The mare's breath was hot and damp on Clara's open palm. Tempest sniffed, flinched, sniffed again. Then, with a shudder that ran the full length of her body like a sigh, she pressed her muzzle into Clara's hand. Clara stroked the white blaze gently. "Good girl," she murmured. "See? That was not so bad. We are going to be all right, you and me." Outside the fence, Red let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be damned," he said. Clara did not look up. She kept her attention on the horse, her hand moving in slow, steady strokes. But she knew Jacob was watching. She could feel his gaze on her like sunlight, steady and warm. When she finally came out of the corral 20 minutes later, Tempest followed her to the gate and stood there watching her go with an expression that was almost disappointed. Jacob was standing by the fence. His hat was off. His face held something Clara had never seen there before, something she could only call wonder. "I am sorry," he said simply. "I underestimated you." It was the first time he had admitted being wrong about anything. And Clara realized in that moment that underneath the wall, underneath the careful control, underneath the polite distance, Jacob Quinn was a man who knew how to listen. He just needed someone brave enough to speak. "Yes, you did," Clara said. "But I forgive you. This time." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. That evening, as the sun went down and the air began to cool, Clara stepped onto the porch and caught her foot on a loose board. She stumbled forward, and Jacob was there, his hands closing around her waist, steadying her, catching her with the quick reflexes of a man used to dealing with 1,000-pound animals. For 3 seconds, they stood like that. His hands on her waist, her hands on his arms, their faces close enough that she could count the lines the sun had etched around his eyes. She could feel the heat of his body through her dress. His breath touched her forehead. His eyes dropped to her mouth. Then he stepped back. "Careful," he said. And he walked away into the dark. Clara stood on the porch alone. Her hand went to her waist, where his hands had been. The warmth lingered there like a brand, and her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with stumbling, and everything to do with those 3 seconds, when Jacob Quinn forgot to keep his distance. That night in bed, the space between them narrowed by a few inches. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them had to. Something had shifted, quiet as a creek changing course, and there was no shifting it back. Red stopped Clara the next morning on his way to the barn. He was carrying a saddle over one shoulder and grinning his gap-toothed grin. "That thing you did with the horse yesterday," he said, "that was something. I have not seen anything like that since, well, ever." "She just needed someone who was not afraid of her," Clara said. Red gave her a long look. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon she did." He glanced toward the house where Jacob was inside eating breakfast, and he tipped his hat and walked on. Clara told herself she was looking for a blanket. She told herself the box under the bed did not matter. But the letter from E had taught her that the things men hid were always the things that mattered most. It had been 6 weeks since the wedding. The days had fallen into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Clara rose before dawn, made breakfast, tended the house and garden while Jacob worked the ranch. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked, and the conversations had begun to deepen, moving past cattle and weather into stories about their pasts. Clara told Jacob about growing up in Missouri, about her father's horses, about the fever that took both her parents in the same week. Jacob told her about building the ranch with his mother, about the cattle drives he had made, about the time a flash flood came down the draw so fast he barely got his horse to high ground. But there were gaps in his stories, places where the words went around something instead of through it. He never talked about his father. He never explained the scar on his arm. He never spoke about the war, though he had clearly served. And whenever Clara ventured near those subjects, the wall came back up, smooth and impenetrable, and Jacob would find a reason to check on the horses or mend a fence. Clara's feelings for him had been growing despite her best efforts to keep them contained. She caught herself watching him work in the yard, noticing the way his shoulders moved under his shirt, the careful way he handled the animals, the sound of his laugh, rare and warm and always surprising when Red said something particularly ridiculous. She found herself looking forward to evenings on the porch, to the way Jacob's voice dropped low and soft when they talked after dark. She found herself reaching across the bed at night to where his warmth was, though she always pulled her hand back before touching him. And that terrified her, because the last man she had let herself care for had carried another woman's letter in his coat lining. Thomas had seemed solid and true, and Thomas had lied. What made her think she could trust her judgment about Jacob Quinn? The letter from E haunted her. She had burned it, destroyed the evidence, and now she could not remember the exact words, only the feeling of reading them, the intimacy, the longing, the initial that could belong to anyone. The doubt had settled into her bones like cold, and every time Jacob did something kind, a small, ugly voice in her head whispered, "What is he hiding? What does he want? What will you find in his coat lining?" That voice was what drove her to look under the bed. Jacob had ridden out early that morning with Red to check fences on the far side of the property. They would be gone most of the day. Clara was alone in the house, and the house was quiet, and the box under the bed had been sitting there since before she arrived, and she needed to know. She told herself she was looking for a blanket. She even went to the closet first, made a show of looking through the shelves, though there was no one to perform for. Then she walked to the bedroom, got on her knees, and pulled out the wooden box. It was plain, unvarnished, the kind of box a person made from scrap lumber because they could not afford a proper chest. The lid was not locked. Inside, she found a woman's handkerchief embroidered with the initials RQ, a spent bullet, a small daguerreotype of a young woman standing beside a boy of maybe 10 years old, the woman's hand on the boy's shoulder. Ruth and Jacob. The boy had the same blue-green eyes, even in the faded photograph. And there was a letter. The handwriting was a woman's, neat but tired. The letters of someone who was educated but had not written much in a long time. Clara unfolded it and read, "Son, I have been wanting to write this for a long time, and I keep not doing it. And I am running out of not doing it, because the doctor says my heart is not what it used to be, and some things need to be said before they cannot be said anymore. I forgave your father a long time ago, but I never forgot. What he did to us was wrong, and nothing makes it right. But holding on to that wrong has made you into something I never wanted for you. You have turned yourself to stone, Jacob. You keep everyone at arm's length. You control every feeling you have like it is a wild horse that might trample you if you let go of the rope. I know you're afraid. I know you think you carry his sickness in your blood, but you are not him. You were never him. You have his temper, yes, you have his strength. But you have my heart, and my heart never hurt anyone on purpose. Do not let the fear of what he was turn you to stone. Find someone to love. Let them love you back. That is all I ever wanted for you. That is the only thing I am asking. Your mother, Ruth." Clara's hands were shaking when she finished reading. She read it again. Then she sat on the floor with the letter in her lap and tried to understand what she had found. Jacob's father. Not dead, as Jacob had implied. Not simply absent. Something worse. Something that had scarred Jacob. Not just the mark on his arm, but something deeper. Something that had made him build that wall and live behind it. She did not know the details. She did not know what Jacob's father had done, but she understood the shape of the wound now. Every gentle distance, every careful word, every time he pulled away when they got too close. It was not coldness, it was fear. Fear of himself. Fear of what he might become if he stopped controlling every feeling that moved through him. She put the letter back in the box. She slid the box under the bed. She did not feel guilty for looking. The letter from E had taught her that ignorance was not safety. But she ached for him now in a way she had not before. She ached for the boy in the photograph and the man he had become, fighting every day against a ghost he could not see. When Jacob came back that afternoon, Clara was waiting on the porch with water and food and a smile that was warmer than usual. He gave her a curious look, but did not ask. "I thought we might ride out together tomorrow," Clara said. "If you are moving cattle, I could help." Jacob hesitated. "You can ride," Clara shrugged. "Enough to stay on a horse." It was not the full truth, but it was not a lie either. She could ride very well. Her father had put her on horseback before she could walk. But she sensed that Jacob needed to feel useful to her, needed to be the one teaching, and she did not mind giving him that. They rode out the next morning under a sky that was enormous and merciless. The day was scorching. Dust coated Clara's teeth within the first mile. The sun hammered down on her hat and shoulders, and the low bawling of 50 head of cattle filled the air with a sound like an argument that nobody was winning. Jacob rode ahead, his seat easy in the saddle, his body moving with the horse in the unconscious way of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off. Red flanked them to the east, whistling tunelessly, and occasionally shouting at a steer that tried to break from the group. The landscape opened up as they moved north, desert valleys stretching toward a line of mesas that shimmered in the heat. The earth was red and gold, studded with sagebrush and mesquite, and the silence between the cattle calls was so deep it felt like a living thing. Clara watched Jacob work and felt something expand in her chest, some knot of fear and doubt loosening by 1 degree. This was a good man doing hard work on land he loved. Whatever he was hiding, whatever had happened with his father, the man in front of her was not a liar in the way Thomas had been a liar. Jacob's secrets were defensive, not betraying. He was protecting himself, not deceiving her. There was a difference, and Clara was beginning to understand it. They had moved the cattle to a new grazing area, and Clara had dismounted to check on a calf that was lagging behind, too young to keep up with the herd, when she heard it. A dry, rapid sound, like someone shaking a handful of seeds in a leather pouch. Except it was not seeds. It was a diamondback rattlesnake coiled in the scrub not 2 feet from her right boot, its tail vibrating so fast it blurred, its flat head raised and aimed at her leg. Clara froze. Every muscle in her body locked. She could not breathe. She could not move. The snake's eyes were black and empty and old as the desert itself, and its mouth was opening, and she could see the fangs, white against the dark interior, and her mind emptied of everything except the sound of that rattle. Jacob moved faster than she thought a man his size could move. He was off his horse and between her and the snake in what felt like a single motion. His knife out of his belt and in his hand, and then buried in the snake's head, with a strike so precise and violent that the rattlesnake was dead before it had time to close its mouth. Then Jacob turned to Clara, and for one unguarded moment she saw his face, and what was on it stopped her heart. Terror, not controlled, not contained, not carefully managed. Raw animal terror at the thought that she could have been bitten, could have been hurt, could have died out here in the dust with his baby in her belly and him not fast enough to stop it. He pulled her against his chest, hard, almost crushing, one hand on the back of her head, his chin on top of her hair. "Do not ever do that to me again," he said, and his voice was rough and broke on the last word. Then he seemed to realize what he was doing and let her go and stepped back, embarrassed by the intensity of his own reaction. It was the most emotion he had shown since the day she met him. And Clara stood there with her heart hammering, the dead snake at her feet, the taste of fear still metallic in her mouth, and realized that she was not shaking because of the rattlesnake. She was shaking because for 5 seconds Jacob Quinn had let the wall come down. And what she had seen behind it was a man who cared about her so much it frightened him. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Red, sensing the charge in the air, kept his jokes to himself. Jacob rode beside Clara, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and he kept glancing at her as if to make sure she was still there. That evening after dinner, Red came to Clara on the porch while Jacob was out checking the fence line. Red sat down on the step below her and was quiet for a while. Then he spoke. "There is something you ought to know about the boss," Red said. He did not look at her. He looked out at the desert going dark. "He is a good man. Best I ever worked for. But he carries something heavy, and it makes him do things that do not always make sense." "Like what?" Clara asked. "Like keeping people at arm's length even when he wants them close. Like working himself to death instead of asking for help. Like being so afraid of his own temper that he would rather be lonely for the rest of his life than risk hurting someone he cares about." Clara felt cold despite the warm night air. Red paused. Then he said, "He is not afraid of whoever is cutting that fence, ma'am. He is afraid of what he might do when he finds them. That is why he keeps everybody at arm's length. He is not scared of the world. He is scared of himself." Red looked at her then, and his usual humor was gone. What was left was the face of a man who had seen things and understood things that most people preferred not to. "And if you are smart," he said, "you will not push him to show you why." Clara looked out at the desert. She thought about Ruth's letter. She thought about the scar on Jacob's arm. She thought about the way his face had gone blank and terrified at the same time when the snake coiled at her feet. And she thought, "I am not smart. I am in love with him." She did not say it out loud, but she felt it settle into her bones like truth. And she knew that whatever was behind Jacob's wall, she was going to find it. Not because she was curious, because she needed to know the whole man before she could give herself to him, and because whatever he was afraid of, she was more afraid of living beside a stranger for the rest of her life. That night in bed, Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness. He did not say a word. He just held on, and Clara held back, and the distance between them closed by another few inches. and neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them had to. Silas Cray invited the whole territory to his autumn dance. Refusing meant declaring war. Accepting meant walking into the enemy's house wearing your best dress and pretending you did not notice the knives. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by one of Silas's men who sat on his horse outside the gate and waited while Red brought the envelope to Jacob. Jacob read it with his face blank as a stone, handed it to Clara, and went back to work without a word. Clara opened it. The paper was thick and expensive. The lettering was printed, not handwritten. Silas Cray requests the honor of your company at the annual Cray Valley Harvest Dance, 2 weeks from Saturday, 6 o'clock in the evening, attire appropriate to the occasion. We have to go, Clara said to Jacob at dinner that night. I know, Jacob said. He did not look happy about it. Red, sitting at the end of the table with a biscuit in each hand, looked between them. I would rather walk into a rattlesnake den wearing meat pants, he offered. But that is just me. Nobody asked you, Jacob said. Nobody ever does, Red agreed cheerfully. On the morning of the dance, Clara found something on the bed that had not been there when she left the room. A dress, not silk or satin or anything fancy, but a deep blue calico with small white flowers, well made, the kind of thing you could find at the general store in town if you knew what to look for and cared enough to look. There was no note. Jacob was already out in the barn. But Clara held the dress up to herself and looked in the small mirror on the wall. And for the first time since Thomas's funeral, she saw something other than a widow looking back at her. She saw a woman whose husband had noticed she needed something beautiful, and had gone and found it without being asked, and left it for her without making a production of it. Thomas had never thought of things like that. Clara put the dress on, and it fit. Not perfectly, it was slightly loose in the waist, which would not be a problem much longer. But the color brought out the warmth in her skin, and the blue was close enough to the blue-green of Jacob's eyes that she wondered if he had chosen it on purpose. She walked out onto the porch, and Jacob was coming up from the barn, cleaned up and shaved and wearing a dark jacket over his best shirt. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved from her face to the dress and back to her face, and the expression that crossed his features was one Clara had never seen on any man looking at her before. It was not desire exactly, though that was part of it. It was more like recognition, like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he saw surprised him and pleased him and scared him in equal measure. You look nice, he said, and his voice was gruff, the way his voice always got when he was feeling something he did not know how to say. Thank you. So do you. Clara paused. Thank you for the dress. Jacob shrugged one shoulder. You needed something that was not black. He helped her onto the wagon, and they rode toward the Cray Ranch with the evening sun turning the desert gold. Red followed on horseback, wearing what appeared to be the same shirt he always wore, but with the addition of a string tie that looked like it had been borrowed from someone with a thinner neck. The Cray property was everything Jacob's was not. It sprawled across the valley like a man lying down, taking up more space than necessary and daring anyone to say something about it. The main house was 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the sunset. Lanterns hung from every post and rail. A fiddle band was playing on a platform near the barn. Horses and wagons and carriages lined the drive, and people milled about in their best clothes, talking and laughing and trying to pretend they were not sizing each other up. Jacob helped Clara down from the wagon. His hands were firm and warm on her waist, and when her feet touched the ground, he did not immediately let go. His hand moved to the small of her back, steady and possessive, and stayed there as they walked toward the gathering. Clara felt the warmth of his palm through the thin calico, and was grateful for it. The whispers started before they reached the porch. Clara heard fragments. Married her inside a week, already showing Lancaster's widow must have been desperate. Quinn always was strange. Jacob's hand pressed slightly harder against her back. He had heard them too, but he kept walking, kept his head up, and Clara matched his stride. The evening began well enough. Martha Green descended on them immediately, loudly proclaiming how wonderful Clara looked, and wasn't that dress just the prettiest shade of blue, effectively silencing the nearest cluster of gossips through sheer volume. Red stationed himself near the refreshment table and commenced eating with the single-minded focus of a man who had not seen a proper spread in months. Then Eliza Cray appeared. She came through the crowd like a ship through water, parting it without effort. She was striking, dark-haired and green-eyed, with a face that was beautiful in a sharp, intelligent way, and she wore an emerald dress that must have cost more than Jacob's best horse. She walked directly to them with a smile that was warm on the surface and complicated underneath. "Jacob," she said, and the way she said his name, familiar, intimate, like she had the right to use it that way, made something in Clara's stomach tighten. "It has been so long. You look well." "Miss Cray," Jacob said. His voice was polite but distant. Eliza turned her attention to Clara. "And you must be the new Mrs. Quinn. I have heard so much about you." She extended a gloved hand. Clara took it. The handshake was brief but firm. "Thank you. I hope it was all good." Eliza laughed, a light, practiced sound. "Oh, Fort Yuma loves a good story." She glanced at Jacob with an expression that Clara could not quite read. "Jacob and I were very close before the war. Did he tell you?" It was not a question. It was a placement of flag. Clara felt jealousy flare in her chest, hot and irrational and utterly unwelcome. She had no right to be jealous. She had been married to Jacob for barely 2 months. But the feeling was there, and the fact that she felt it told her exactly how far she had already fallen. Jacob's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago, Miss Cray." Eliza smiled. "Yes, it was." She touched his arm, lingered for a moment, then drifted away into the crowd. Clara watched her go. "Who is she, really?" Clara asked, keeping her voice light. "Silas Cray's daughter," Jacob said, "and nothing else." Clara wanted to believe him. She chose to believe him. But the doubt was there, another seed planted in soil that was already too full of them. Halfway through the evening, Silas Cray found Jacob. Clara watched from across the room as Silas pulled her husband aside for a private conversation near the back of the barn. She could not hear the words, but she could read the body language. Silas was all smiles and open hands, leaning in, gesturing expansively. Jacob was still as a fence post, arms crossed, face closed. When Jacob came back, his expression was dark. He stood beside Clara and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "He is threatening to dam the creek. He wants the land. He offered to buy at double the value." "And you said no," Clara said. "It was not a question. I said no." He looked at her. "He is not going to stop. You should know that." "I know," Clara said. "And he should know that neither are we." Something passed across Jacob's face that might have been surprise, might have been gratitude, might have been the beginning of love. He did not say anything, but his hand found the small of her back again, and stayed there. The trouble came an hour later. A ranch hand from another outfit, a big rough-faced man who had been drinking steadily all evening, found himself standing near Clara at the refreshment table. Red had stepped away to use the privy. Jacob was 15 feet across the room talking to another rancher. The drunk man looked Clara up and down with the bleary, appraising eye of a man who had never learned that women were not livestock. "So you are the one Quinn picked up," the man said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "I heard you came second-hand." He laughed at his own joke. Clara went still. The humiliation hit her like a slap, not because she cared what this man thought, but because the words were calculated to wound. And they did. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something cutting and cold and precise the way her mother had taught her, but she never got the chance. Jacob crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not warn the man. He did not raise his voice. He did not say a word. He hit the drunk so hard the man's boots left the ground. The man went down on his back, and Jacob was on top of him, hitting him again with a fist that moved like a piston, mechanical and relentless. The sound of knuckles hitting flesh was wet and ugly in the sudden silence. But it was Jacob's face that stopped Clara's heart. It was blank, not angry, not furious, not righteous. Blank, empty. Like a door had opened inside him and something mechanical and bottomless was operating his hands. His eyes were flat as coins. Red was there suddenly, grabbing Jacob from behind, hauling him up bodily. And it took real effort because Jacob was strong, and whatever was driving him did not want to stop. "Easy, boss," Red was saying. "Easy. That is enough. That is enough." Jacob stopped. He stood there with Red's arms around him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. The drunk was on the floor, groaning, his face a mess. The whole room was staring. Then Jacob's eyes found Clara, and she saw the moment he came back to himself, the moment the blankness cleared and he saw what she was looking at, and what crossed his face was worse than anything the drunk had said. It was horror, horror at himself. He pulled free of Red. He walked out of the barn without a word. Clara stood in the silence, her heart pounding, her mouth dry. She had seen what Jacob was afraid of. She had seen the ghost, and she understood now, with a clarity that shook her to her boots, why he kept the wall up, why he controlled everything, why Ruth had written that letter. She followed him outside. She found him by the wagon, leaning against the wheel with his head down and his bleeding hands hanging at his sides. The moon was up, full and white, and it turned the desert to silver. "Jacob," she said. He did not look up. "You should go back inside." "I'm not going back inside without my husband." He was quiet for a long time. "Then you saw it." "Yes, that is what I am, Clara. That is what is inside me. It comes out and I cannot stop it. I hit that man and I was not even angry anymore. I was just doing it, like a machine." Clara stepped closer. "That man deserved what he got." Jacob shook his head. "It is not about what he deserved. It is about what I turned into for 10 seconds. You saw it. Do not pretend you did not." Clara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way her father had taught her to choose her steps in a corral full of wild horses. Carefully, deliberately, without fear. "My father had a temper," she said. "He broke a man's jaw once at a horse auction. The man had been whipping a mare bloody and would not stop. My father laid him out with one punch and the marshal had to pull him off. But that same man, my father, he never once raised a hand to me or my mother, not once in all his years. Having the capacity for violence and being violent are not the same thing, Jacob." He looked at her then, and Clara saw the wall crack. Not fall, not yet, but crack. What was behind it was not a monster. It was a man who was terribly, desperately afraid of hurting the people he cared about. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "You should be. Well, I am not, and I am too tired to argue about it." He almost smiled. Almost. And then Clara did something she had been wanting to do for weeks. She stepped close, put her hand on his chest where his heart was beating hard under her palm, rose up on her toes, and kissed him. Jacob went still as a statue. For one terrible second she thought he would pull away. Then his hands came up, one on her waist, one on the back of her neck, and he kissed her back. Slow at first, tentative, as if he were handling something fragile. Then deeper, hungrier, full of all the things they had been holding back since the day he caught her on the porch and stepped away. The taste of wine was faint on his lips. The moonlight was silver on them. The desert stretched out on every side, vast and empty and ancient, and they were the only two people in it. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that since the corral," Jacob said. His voice was rough. "I have wanted you to do that since you walked back into that church," Clara replied. They rode home in the moonlight. Clara's hand rested on Jacob's thigh, and his free hand covered hers, and neither of them spoke, because speaking would have broken whatever fragile, beautiful thing had just opened between them. When they got home, they did not make love. Not yet. But they lay close in bed for the first time. Clara's head on Jacob's chest, his arm around her, his heartbeat under her ear, steady and strong. She was almost asleep when she heard Red's voice from outside. urgent and wrong. "Boss, you need to come see this." Jacob was up and out of bed before Clara was fully awake. She followed him to the porch. Red was standing at the edge of the yard, his face gray in the moonlight. "The creek," Red said. Jacob was off the porch in an instant. Clara followed, her bare feet on the cold ground. They stood at the bank where water had flowed that morning. It was dry, bone dry. The rocks at the bottom were already white with dust, like the bones of something that had died fast. Somewhere upstream, Silas Cray had built himself a dam, and summer had 2 months left to burn. It was not the drought that killed ranches. It was what men did to each other when the water stopped. By the second day without water, 3 of the weaker calves were struggling. By the 4th day, Jacob had to haul water from the Colorado River in barrels, a 12-mile round trip that ate half a day and wore the horses to stumbling. By the end of the first week, Clara could see the cost in Jacob's face. He was thinner, harder. His eyes had gone flat in a way that reminded her of the dance, that mechanical blankness that scared her more than anger ever could. He worked from before dawn until after dark, digging a new well on the south end of the property where Red thought they might hit groundwater. He swung the pickaxe with a fury that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with the kind of rage that a man like Jacob could not express any other way. He barely ate, he barely spoke. He came to bed long after Clara was asleep and rose before she woke, and the tender man who had kissed her under the moonlight disappeared behind a wall thicker than the one that had been there before. Clara tried to reach him. She brought food to the well site, and he thanked her without looking up. She asked how the digging was going, and he said fine. She asked if she could help, and he said no. She asked what she could do, and he said, just take care of yourself and the baby. Each dismissal was a small knife, not cruel, just closed. The door was shut, and the key was turned, and Jacob was on the other side of it, alone with his fury, and he would not let her in. It was like being married to Thomas all over again. Not the kindness, not the sweetness, but the absence. The feeling of being in a house with someone and being entirely alone. Clara had sworn she would never feel that way again. And here she was, standing at the kitchen window, watching her husband destroy himself one pickaxe swing at a time, and he would not even look at her. On the 8th day, Clara saddled a horse and rode to town. She told Red she needed supplies. What she needed was air, space to think, space to be angry without the guilt of knowing Jacob was suffering too. She was in the general store comparing the price of flour to the dwindling contents of her purse, when a voice behind her said, "You look tired, Clara." Clara turned. Eliza Cray stood in the aisle, dressed impeccably as always, her dark hair pinned under a hat that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. Her expression was sympathetic. Her eyes were not. "I am fine," Clara said. "Thank you." Eliza stepped closer. "I feel terrible for you. Truly, it must be so hard." Something in her tone made Clara's skin prickle. "What do you mean?" Eliza tilted her head. "Oh, you do not know." She paused, and Clara could see the calculation behind the sympathy, the careful placement of words like a card player laying down a hand. "I assumed Jacob had told you the real reason he married you." The floor seemed to tilt slightly. Clara kept her voice level. "I am sure I do not know what you're talking about." "The morality clause," Eliza said, as if discussing the weather. "In your late husband's loan agreement. My father told me about it. It allows the bank to seize the property if the borrower's family engages in conduct considered scandalous or contrary to public decency." Clara said nothing. Her hands were very still. "A pregnant widow living alone on disputed land," Eliza continued. "By the standards of this territory, that could certainly be considered scandalous. Enough for a judge to invoke the clause anyway. My father was planning to use it. He told Jacob, or rather, I believe Doc Harlan told Jacob, before the wedding." She paused. "He married you to neutralize the clause, Clara. A pregnant woman with a husband is not scandalous. It is just a family." Clara stood in the general store aisle with flour on the shelf beside her and a hole opening in her chest. She thought about Jacob in the church, the way he had walked out and come back, the way he had offered to pay her debt no matter what, the way he had set his one rule, no lies, and said it like a man who meant it more than anything he had ever said. And he had known. Before the proposal, before the wedding, before the ring, he had known about the morality clause. He had known that marrying her would protect his water rights, and he had not told her. "Where is this clause?" Clara asked. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "In the loan documents at the bank," Eliza said. "My father keeps copies." Clara put the flour down. She walked out of the general store and across the street to the Cray Valley Bank. The building was cool inside, almost pleasant after the heat, and it smelled of paper and ink and money. Silas Cray's office was in the back, behind a door with his name on it in gold letters. Clara knocked. She did not wait for an answer. She opened the door and walked in. Silas was behind his desk, a handsome old rattlesnake in a fine suit, and the look on his face when he saw Clara told her he had not expected this. He recovered quickly. "Mrs. Quinn, what a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you?" "I want to see my late husband's loan documents," Clara said. "All of them, including any clauses or provisions that may affect the disposition of the property." Silas studied her. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who thinks he is holding all the cards. "Of course." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Thomas Lancaster's file. It is all public record, of course. You are welcome to review it." Clara took the folder. She sat down in the chair across from Silas's desk without being invited. She opened the file and read. The morality clause was on the third page, buried in dense language designed to be overlooked by anyone who was not looking for it. It said exactly what Eliza had described. In the event that the borrower, or any member of the borrower's household, shall engage in conduct deemed scandalous, immoral, or contrary to public decency, as determined by the holder of this instrument, the full balance of the loan shall become immediately due and payable, and in the event of non-payment, the collateral property shall be forfeit. Clara read it 3 times. Her hands were steady, her chest was not. She closed the folder and set it on the desk. "Thank you," she said. Then she stood and walked out of the bank. The ride home took an hour. Clara used every minute of it. She did not cry. She did not scream. She organized her thoughts the way she organized a kitchen, everything in its place, everything where she could find it. Jacob was at the well site when she returned. He was shirtless in the heat, swinging the pickaxe, his back running with sweat, the scar on his arm standing out white against his tanned skin. He looked up when he heard the horse and straightened slowly, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Clara dismounted. She walked to him without speaking. She pulled the loan document from her pocket, the copy Silas had let her take, and set it on the ground between them. "Did you know about this before you proposed?" she said. Jacob looked at the document. His face drained of color the way water drains from a creek when someone dams it upstream, slowly, and then all at once. He was quiet for too long. "Doc Harlan told me Silas was planning to use it," he said. "Yes. So you married me to protect your water." "I married you because you needed help and I could give it. But the water mattered." "Jacob," her voice cracked. "Did the water matter?" His silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. She could feel it humming. She could feel it about to snap. "Yes," he said finally. "It was part of it, not all of it, not even most of it. But I cannot stand here and tell you it did not cross my mind. Doc Harlan told me what Silas was planning. I knew that if you had a husband, the clause was worthless, and I knew your land sat on my water." He swallowed. "But that is not why I walked back into that church, Clara. That is not why I am standing here." Clara looked at this man who had kissed her under the moonlight, this man who had killed a rattlesnake to keep her safe, this man who had set one rule, just one, no lies, and then broken it before the ring was even on her finger. The man who made no lies his only rule, Clara said, and her voice was quiet and terrible. Built our marriage on one. Jacob flinched. It was the first time she had ever seen him flinch at words. Clara turned and walked into the house. She went to the bedroom and took her pillow from the bed. She carried it to Ruth's old room and closed the door, quietly, without slamming it. Somehow the quiet click of the latch was worse than if she had brought the wall down. She sat on Ruth's bed in the dim room and pressed her hands to her belly where the baby moved, a small flutter like a bird testing its wings. She did not cry. She was too angry to cry, and underneath the anger too heartbroken. Through the thin wall she heard something break, the sound of a fist hitting wood, hard. Once, then silence. The silence lasted all night. In the morning, Clara found blood on the door frame where Jacob had hit it, dried, brown, and ugly, and on the kitchen table a note in his rough handwriting. Gone to dig the well. I am sorry. Clara stared at the blood in the note and tried to decide which one told the truth. Silas Cray came to the ranch on Monday morning with a lawyer, a bill of sale, and the smile of a vulture that had spotted something that stopped moving. They rode up in a buggy, Silas and a thin, sharp-faced man in a city suit who turned out to be a lawyer from Tucson named Whitfield. Red saw them coming and had time to warn Jacob, who came in from the well site with the pickaxe still in his hand and murder in his eyes. Clara stepped onto the porch and watched the exchange. Silas stayed in the buggy. He did not dismount. That told Clara everything she needed to know about how he saw the situation. He did not need to stand on their ground. He owned it already, or thought he did. Quinn, Silas said, I am going to make this simple. I am offering to buy your entire property at 50% above market value. That includes the homestead, the Lancaster parcel, the grazing rights, everything. Whitfield here has drawn up the papers. The lawyer held up a document. Clara could see the seals and signatures from the porch. Jacob set the pickaxe down, slowly, deliberately. No, Silas smiled. Think carefully. Your creek is dry, your cattle are dying, your well is not producing. Your wife is due in a matter of weeks. Winter is coming. If you insist on staying, I intend to file a claim in territorial court asserting that any groundwater you tap from that well is connected to my upstream water system and therefore falls under my established rights. That is not how water law works, Clara said from the porch. All three men looked at her. Silas's smile thinned. Whitfield blinked as if a piece of furniture had spoken. Water law in this territory is whatever a judge says it is, Silas said, and I have been very generous with the judges in this territory. He turned back to Jacob. Do not let pride kill your family, Quinn. Take the offer. Move on. Start over somewhere that does not have me in it. Jacob picked up the pickaxe. Get off my land, he said, and Silas studied him for a moment. Then he shrugged, pleasant as a preacher. My door remains open. He nodded to the lawyer, flicked the reins, and the buggy turned and headed back down the road. Clara watched them go. Then she looked at Jacob. He was gripping the pickaxe handle so hard his knuckles were white. A vein stood out in his temple. We need to talk, Clara said. Jacob looked at her. The wall was up, thick and high, but there was something behind it that had not been there before. Something that looked like surrender. Come inside, Clara said. And he did. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had their first meal together, the same table where Clara had found the blood and the note. They had barely spoken in 5 days. The distance between them filled the room like smoke. Clara did not start with the morality clause. She did not start with the water. She started with what she had found in the box under the bed. Jacob, she said, I found your mother's letter, the one she wrote to you before she died. His face went absolutely still. And I found the other letter, she continued, the one postmarked from the territorial prison at Yuma, from a man named Emmett Quinn. Jacob's mouth opened, closed. His hands, flat on the table, began to tremble. Your father did not die, Clara said. Not the way you told people. He went to prison for hurting you and your mother." The silence in the room was so complete Clara could hear the wind moving around the corners of the house. She could hear Jacob breathing, short, controlled breaths, the breathing of a man who was holding something down with everything he had. Then the dam broke, not with rage, not with the blank mechanical violence she had seen at the dance, with grief. Jacob put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and made a sound that Clara had never heard from a grown man before. It was the sound of 20 years of silence cracking apart. He talked. Once he started, he could not stop. He told her about Emmett's drinking, the nights when the bottle came out and the house went quiet, and Jacob's mother would send him to the loft and tell him not to come down no matter what he heard. The sound of breaking things, the sound of his mother crying through the thin floorboards. The morning he came down and saw the bruises she tried to hide with long sleeves and high collars, and how she would smile at him and say everything was fine when everything was the opposite of fine. He told her about the night it ended. He was 14. Emmett came home drunker than usual. Jacob tried to step between his father and his mother. Emmett grabbed his leather belt, the one with the heavy metal buckle, and swung it. The buckle caught Jacob's forearm and tore a gash from elbow to wrist. The scar Clara had seen every day since the wedding. The scar, he told everyone, came from the war. His mother had gotten the shotgun. She pointed it at Emmett's chest and told him if he did not leave, she would pull the trigger and face whatever the Lord had to say about it. Emmett left. The county sheriff arrested him the next morning. The trial was quick. 3 years in the territorial prison at Yuma for assault. Ruth told the town Emmett had died of fever on a cattle drive. She told Jacob to forget his father ever existed. She built the ranch with her own hands and her son beside her, and she never spoke Emmett's name again. But Jacob had not forgotten. He remembered the rage on his father's face. He remembered the sound of the belt. He remembered the blood running down his arm, and the way Emmett looked at him with something that was not anger, not malice, but something worse, absence. Like the man behind his father's eyes had left the room, the same look Clara had seen on Jacob's face at the dance. "I have got his blood," Jacob said. His voice was raw and broken. "I have got his temper. You saw it. I hit that man, and I could not stop. For 10 seconds I was him. I was exactly him. That is why I do not let anyone close. That is why I control everything. Because if I stop controlling it for 1 second, that is what comes out." He looked at Clara with eyes that were red and wet and terrified. "I have never loved anyone the way I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I have never had this much to lose." Clara looked at this man. This broken, terrified, gentle, violent, generous, secretive, infuriating man who had married her when she had nothing, who had kissed her under the moonlight, who had killed a snake to save her, who had lied about his reasons and lied about his father, and set a rule about lying that he could not follow himself. "You are not your father," she said. "You have never hurt me." He shook his head. "You do not understand. I understand better than you think." She leaned forward. "I watched you gentle a calf last week that was caught in wire. I watched you carry Red's saddle when his back gave out, and you did not tell him you did it. I watched you talk to this baby through my belly every night for a week, before the creek dried up." She put her hand on his. "The man who does those things is not the man who beat his wife and child. You have his temper. You do not have his cruelty. There is a difference, Jacob, and it matters." He stared at her. Tears ran down his weathered face, and he did not wipe them away. "But you lied to me," Clara said, and her voice was steady, but her heart was not. "About the morality clause, about your father. You made no lies your one rule, and then you broke it before we even started. I need to know why." "Because I was ashamed," Jacob said simply, "of my father, of the water calculation, of all of it. I was ashamed, and I thought if you knew you would leave, and I could not bear that." "So you decided for me," Clara said. "You decided what I could handle and what I could not, and you did not give me the choice." "Yes," he whispered. And I was wrong. Clara pulled her hand back. She sat with it for a long moment. I need time, she said. Not forever, not to leave, but time. Jacob nodded. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stood up. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and did not know how to put himself back together. All right, he said. She watched him walk out the door and pick up the pickaxe and go back to the well. And she sat at the table and let the tears come finally, because she loved him, and she was furious with him, and she understood him, and she was not sure any of those things canceled out the others. That afternoon, Clara rode to town to see Martha Green. She needed to talk to someone who was not Jacob and was not Red and was not the inside of her own head. Martha made tea. Clara sat in the pastor's kitchen and held the warm cup and told Martha about the morality clause, and Martha clucked and shook her head but did not look surprised. Then Clara mentioned Thomas. She mentioned the letter she had burned, the one signed E. And Martha's face did something complicated. It went through surprise and guilt and resignation in the space of 2 seconds. And Clara knew, the way you know a storm is coming before you see the clouds, that Martha had been carrying a secret too. Martha, Clara said, what do you know? Martha set down her teacup. She was quiet for a long time. Then she sighed the way a woman sighs, when a burden she has been carrying for years finally gets too heavy to hold. Thomas and Eliza Cray were involved before you came to Fort Yuma, Martha said. They were courting. Everyone in town knew. Silas encouraged it because he wanted Thomas's land in the family through marriage. But Thomas met you and he chose you. He ended things with Eliza. Silas took it as a betrayal. And that is when the loan started. Clara sat very still. She said. The letter was from Eliza. Martha nodded. It was old, from before your marriage. Thomas was not unfaithful to you, Clara. He chose you. But Silas never forgave him for it, and everything that has happened since, the loans, the morality clause, the water, all of it goes back to that. Silas wanted that land in his family, and when he could not get it through marriage, he decided to take it by force. Clara stared into her tea. Thomas's secret was not what she had feared. He had not betrayed her. He had been a man with a past, as everyone was, and he had chosen her, and he had died before he could explain. And Silas Cray's vendetta was not just business. It was personal, built on rejection and wounded pride, and it had been running for years. She thought about Eliza in the general store, dropping the morality clause revelation like poison into a well. Jealousy and guilt in equal measure. A woman used as a weapon by her father, whether she understood it or not. Clara finished her tea. She thanked Martha. She rode home. The ranch was quiet when she arrived. Jacob was at the well. Red was in the barn. The sun was going down, painting the sky the color of bruises. She went to bed in Ruth's room and lay there thinking about Thomas and Eliza and Silas, about Jacob and his father and the scar and the lie, about the morality clause and the water and the law, about a baby growing inside her who did not care about any of this and just needed to be born safe. She was nearly asleep when Red's shout cut through the night. "Boss, we got a problem." Clara was on the porch before the words finished. Red was standing at the new well, holding a lantern. Jacob was beside him, and even in the yellow light, Clara could see that his face was white. "Somebody poisoned the well," Red said. His voice was flat with barely contained rage. "Dumped lye in it during the night. I found 3 head dead in the south pasture. They must have drunk from the runoff." Clara's hand went to her mouth. 3 cattle, dead. Not from drought, from deliberate, calculated cruelty. Jacob stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the house without a word. Clara followed him. She watched him take his rifle from the wall. She watched him strap on his gun belt. She watched him check the loads in his revolver with quick, practiced hands that did not shake. "Jacob," she said, "do not." He stopped at the door. He did not turn around. "If I am not back by sunrise," he said, "send for Doc Harlan. Tell him to bring Sarah Dunlap, too. Make sure the baby comes safe." "Jacob." But he stepped through the door and into the darkness, and the night swallowed him whole. Clara did not send for Doc Harlan. She pulled Thomas's rifle from the wall, saddled the horse that no one else could ride, and followed her husband into the dark. The night was cold. The desert dropped its temperature like a stone once the sun went down, and the air bit through Clara's dress and chilled the sweat on her back. She did not care. She did not think about the cold or the dark or the baby or the fact that she was riding a wild Mustang bareback through rattlesnake country at midnight. She thought about one thing only: Jacob's face when he said, "Make sure the baby comes safe." That was a man saying goodbye. She had heard it in Thomas's voice the last morning, the morning he walked out to the barn and did not come back. "I will be home by noon." The same lightness, the same lie. She would not lose another husband to this desert. Tempest moved beneath her like black water, fast and sure. The mare who threw everyone, who bit and kicked and fought every hand laid on her, carried Clara through the dark as if they had been partners for years. Clara's legs gripped the horse's barrel, her hands wound in the thick mane, and she leaned forward and whispered, "Find him, girl," the way her father used to talk to his best horse. And Tempest ran. Red was behind her. She had pounded on his door before she left, told him what Jacob had done, and Red had said 3 words that were not fit for church and grabbed his gun. He was following on his own horse, but Tempest was faster, and Clara reached Silas's property line first. She heard them before she saw them. Voices, raised and angry, and the sound of a scuffle. She reined Tempest toward the noise and came around a stand of mesquite to find Jacob in a clearing at the edge of Silas's land, facing 2 men. They were Silas's ranch hands. Clara recognized one of them from the dance. They were armed, one with a rifle and one with a pistol, and Jacob was standing between them with blood running from a gash on his temple, where someone had hit him with a rifle butt. His own rifle was on the ground behind him. He was unarmed and hurt and still on his feet, still standing between these men and his property, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had stopped caring what happened to himself. One of the men raised his pistol. Clara drove Tempest between them. The black mare came out of the darkness like a thunderbolt, 1,500 pounds of wild horse and fury, and both men stumbled backward, one of them falling, the other dropping his pistol in the dust. Tempest reared, her front hooves slashing the air, and screamed the high, furious scream of a wild animal, and the men scrambled away like rabbits. Clara leveled Thomas's rifle. She had not fired a gun since her father died, but her father had taught her to shoot the way he taught her to ride, and some lessons the body never forgot. "Next one is not aimed at the sky," she said, and her voice carried across that clearing with the authority of a woman who had lost everything once and would burn the world down before she let it happen again. Red arrived 30 seconds later, his gun drawn, and his red hair wild. He pulled up beside Clara and assessed the situation with a soldier's eye. "You boys have about 3 seconds to get on your horses and ride," Red said conversationally, "or I will let the lady shoot you and we will sort out the legalities in the morning." Silas's men ran. They mounted their horses and disappeared into the dark toward the Cray Ranch, and the sound of their hoofbeats faded until the night was quiet again. Jacob stood in the clearing. Blood ran down the side of his face. He was looking at Clara on the back of the wild horse, with the rifle across her lap and the moonlight in her hair, and the expression on his face was something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was the look of a man who has been drowning and sees the surface for the first time. "You," he said, and then could not finish the sentence. "Get on the horse," Clara said. "We are going home." Red helped Jacob up behind Clara on Tempest. The mare accepted the extra weight without complaint, as if she understood that this was important. Jacob wrapped his arms around Clara's waist, his chest against her back, his face against her hair. She could feel him shaking. They rode home in silence. At the ranch, Clara cleaned the blood from Jacob's face. She sat him in a chair by the fireplace and heated water and washed the gash on his temple with a gentleness that contradicted the steel in her eyes. Her hands were steady. His were not. "You could have been killed," Jacob said. "You are carrying a child." "What were you thinking?" I was thinking that my husband rode off to die, and I was not going to let him. I was not going to die. You told me to send for the midwife. You said goodbye. Do not lie to me now. Silence. Jacob caught her hand as she reached for the cloth again. He held it. His grip was tight, almost desperate. I am sorry, he said, for all of it. The morality clause, my father, the lies, riding off tonight like some fool who thinks dying is the same as fixing things. Clara looked at him. She looked at the blood on his face and the scar on his arm and the wet tracks on his cheeks and the desperate, terrified love in his blue-green eyes. You set one rule when we married, she said. No lies. You broke it. I know. So here is my rule. No more going alone. We are partners. You said that the first day in the church. I believed you then. Make me believe it again. He pulled her onto his lap, gently, mindful of the baby, and he kissed her. Not gentle this time, not tentative, desperate and honest and full of everything he had been too afraid to say for his entire life. Clara kissed him back with equal force, and in that kiss was every hurt and every hope and every wall that had come down between them. That night, in their bed, with the lamp turned low and the desert wind pressing against the windows, they came together as husband and wife for the first time. Not just the physical act, though that was fierce and tender in equal measure. It was the joining of two people who had finally stopped holding back. Every secret was known. Every wound was open. Every wall was down. In the quiet afterward, Clara lay in Jacob's arms and said, "We are going to fight Silas Cray, not with guns, with the law. And we are going to win." Jacob looked at her. How? Clara had been thinking about this since the night at the bank. Thomas kept a letter, she said, in his own handwriting. It says Silas pressured him to sell the land before the loan defaulted. That is evidence of a pattern. The morality clause itself is proof of predatory lending. The poisoned well is a criminal act. And Doc Harlan can testify that Silas has done the same thing to other families. Jacob's eyes sharpened. Doc knows. Doc knows everything, Clara said. He delivered half the babies in this town and buried the other half. People tell him things. He told me last week that Silas drove at least 3 other families off their land in the past 10 years, all of them too poor or too scared to fight back. None of them had you, Jacob said. Clara smiled. No, they did not. In the morning, Red came to the house. He sat at the table and drank coffee and was quiet for a long time. Then he set his cup down and spoke. There is something I need to tell you both, he said. His face was serious, all the humor gone. Before I worked for you, boss, I spent 6 months working for Silas Cray. Jacob went still. I saw things, Red continued. His men cutting fences on other people's property, tamping with water sources, running cattle off land Silas wanted. I left because I could not stomach it anymore, but I never said anything because I figured nobody would believe a man with a record. 2 years in the county jail in Tucson. You know about that, boss. Cattle theft. I did it. I was 19 and stupid, but I served my time, and I have been straight since. The question is whether a judge would take my word over Silas Cray's. Red looked at Clara, and under the bravado and the jokes and the missing tooth, she saw a man who was afraid. Afraid that his past would define him forever. Afraid that the one good thing he could do with his story would be thrown out because of a mistake he made as a boy. Clara reached across the table and put her hand on his. A man who served his time and tells the truth is worth more to a judge than a rich man who never got caught. Red looked at her hand on his, then he looked at her face. Something in his expression shifted, and Clara realized it was the same thing she had seen in Jacob's face the night she rode Tempest into that clearing. The look of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was finally allowed to set it down. "Tell me where to sign," he said. Clara sat down to write the petition to the territorial court. She dipped the pen, set it to the paper, and got 3 lines written before the pain hit. Sharp, deep, undeniable. It started in her lower back and wrapped around her belly like a fist clenching, and she gripped the edge of the table and breathed through it, and when it passed, she looked down at the wet spot spreading on the chair and knew. The baby was 3 weeks early, and the dust storm building on the horizon was the worst Red had seen in 5 years. The baby did not wait for the law, did not wait for the doctor, did not wait for the storm to pass. He came into the world the way Quinman apparently did everything, on his own terms, in the worst possible conditions, screaming. Red rode for town as soon as Clara told him. He rode into the teeth of the dust storm like a man possessed, but the storm was faster and meaner, and the road to Fort Yuma disappeared behind a wall of flying sand that turned the air brown and the sky to nothing. Sarah Dunlap could not get through. Doc Harlan was trapped behind shuttered windows in town. Red made it halfway, turned back before the storm killed his horse, and staggered into the barn caked in dust and cursing Silas Cray, the weather, and the Almighty, in approximately that order. It was Jacob, Clara, and the baby, alone in a house that shook with every gust. Jacob carried Clara to the bed. She was already in the grip of contractions that came faster and harder than she had expected, and the pain was enormous. A thing with claws and teeth that tore through her body and left her gasping. The wind howled outside. Sand hissed against the windows like a living thing trying to get in. Jacob's face was white. His hands, the hands that broke horses and dug wells and swung pickaxes and hit men hard enough to lift them off the ground, were shaking. Clara gripped his arm. She looked into his blue-green eyes and said through clenched teeth, "I am going to talk you through this. You just have to listen. Can you do that?" He swallowed. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." Clara talked. Between the contractions, in the brief windows where the pain released her enough to speak, she told him what to do. Boil water, tear clean cloths, wash your hands. She had helped Sarah Dunlap deliver a neighbor's baby 6 months ago and had paid attention, and now she thanked God for that because the knowledge was all that stood between her child and the howling dark. Jacob listened. He did everything she said. He boiled water on the stove. He tore strips from a clean sheet. He washed his hands until they were raw. And when the contractions came and Clara cried out, he held her hand and talked to her the way she had talked to Tempest in the corral. Quiet, steady, patient, never looking away. "Easy now," he said, and his voice did not shake even though his hands still did. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere. You are the strongest person I've ever known, and you can do this." The labor was long, hours that felt like days. The storm raged outside, battering the walls, sending dust through every crack and gap. Clara screamed and pushed and breathed and pushed again, and Jacob was there for every second of it, his hand in hers, his voice in her ear, his eyes never leaving her face. And then, just as the storm began to ease and the first gray light of dawn crept under the door, the baby came. Jacob caught him. A boy, red-faced, furious, alive. The cry that came out of that tiny body cut through the fading wind like a knife through cloth, sharp and strong and unmistakably present. The sound of a new life demanding to be heard. Jacob held his son. He held him in those big, scarred, work-roughened hands. The hands he had been afraid of his whole life. The hands he thought were built for destruction. And those hands cradled the baby as gently as they had ever held anything. He wept, not quietly, not behind a wall, openly, the way a man cries when something inside him that has been locked for 20 years finally breaks free, and what rushes in to fill the space is not pain, but light. "He is looking at me," Jacob whispered. Clara, exhausted, drenched in sweat, smiling through her own tears, reached for them both. "Of course he is," she said. He is looking at his father." Jacob brought the baby to her. Clara took him against her chest and felt the warm, impossible weight of new life, and the love that flooded through her was so enormous, it obliterated everything else. The pain, the fear, the anger, the secrets, all of it washed away like dust in rain. This was Thomas's son by blood, but he would be Jacob's son by choice and by love, and that was stronger than any bloodline. "What is his name?" Jacob asked. They had talked about names during the good weeks, the weeks of moonlight and slow burn and the smell of sage on evening air. Clara had suggested Thomas. Jacob had suggested James. "James Thomas Quinn," Clara said. "James for the father you wish yours had been. Thomas for the man who gave him life." Jacob's eyes met hers. His face was raw and open and unguarded, every wall down, every scar visible, and what was behind all of it was love. Simple, enormous, terrifying love. "James Thomas Quinn," he repeated. "That is a name that means something." "It means we get to choose who we are," Clara said, "no matter who came before us." Red burst through the door 10 minutes later, covered in dust, half blind from the storm, and found Jacob sitting on the bed beside Clara with the baby in his arms, and tears still wet on his face. Red looked at the baby. He looked at Jacob. He looked at Clara. Then he sat down on the floor and put his head in his hands and said, "Well, I will be damned." And nobody told him to watch his language. 2 weeks later, Clara finished writing the petition to the territorial court. She did more than write it. She traveled to the county seat herself. She rode in Jacob's wagon with James bundled against her chest, and the evidence organized in a leather folder she had borrowed from Doc Harlan. Jacob drove. Red rode alongside with his rifle across his saddle just in case. Clara stood before the territorial judge, a weathered man named Garrett, who had a reputation for fairness that Silas Cray's money had not yet been able to buy. She presented Thomas's letter, documenting Silas's attempt to pressure the sale of the Lancaster property. She presented the morality clause, explaining how it had been buried in the loan documents to be used as a weapon against vulnerable borrowers. She presented Doc Harlan's sworn testimony describing 3 other families driven from their land by identical tactics over the past decade. And she presented the affidavit of Redmond Buckley, former employee of Silas Cray, detailing what he had witnessed during his 6 months on the Cray Ranch: fence cutting, water tampering, intimidation, given under oath despite his criminal record. The judge read Red's statement carefully. He looked at Red sitting in the gallery with his hat in his hands and his red hair combed for what might have been the first time in months. "Mr. Buckley," the judge said, "you have a criminal record." "Yes, sir," Red said. 2 years in the county jail in Tucson. Cattle theft. I did it, and I served my time. And you are willing to testify under oath about what you saw on the Cray Ranch?" "Yes, sir." "Every word of it." The judge looked at Red for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, standing before him with a 2-week-old baby in her arms and steel in her spine. The territorial court issued its ruling within the week. Silas Cray was ordered to dismantle the dam and restore natural water flow to all downstream properties. He was ordered to pay restitution for livestock lost to the poisoned well and the water diversion. The morality clause was struck from all existing loan agreements held by the Cray Valley Bank as unconscionable and contrary to territorial law. The poisoning of the well was referred to the county sheriff as a criminal matter. Silas's 2 ranch hands were arrested and held in the county jail in Fort Yuma. Silas himself was charged with conspiracy and criminal destruction of property. He was arrested at his own ranch in front of his own house and taken to the county jail to await trial. His lawyer from Tucson could not help him. The evidence was too strong and the judge was too honest. Silas Cray's empire did not fall with a bang. It crumbled. Other families came forward once they saw it was safe. Other stories emerged. The man who had controlled Fort Yuma through money and fear for a decade discovered that fear only works as long as nobody stands up, and a pregnant woman who read the fine print had been the first one to stand. A week after the ruling, Eliza Cray came to the Quinn ranch. Clara saw her riding up the road and went to the porch. Jacob started to come with her, but Clara put a hand on his arm and said, "Let me." Eliza dismounted. She stood in the yard, looking smaller than Clara had ever seen her. The expensive clothes were the same, but the woman inside them had changed. The sharpness was gone. What remained was someone tired and ashamed and trying to find the courage to do something hard. "I came to apologize," Eliza said, "for what I said to you in the store, for what my father did, for all of it." Clara studied her. She thought about the letter from E. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the girl in the general store who had dropped poison into a conversation the way her father's men dropped lye into a well. Then she thought about herself. A woman who had married a stranger out of desperation. A woman who had searched her husband's belongings out of fear. A woman who had made choices she was not proud of, because the circumstances left her no other option. "Thomas chose me," Clara said. "I know that now, but I do not blame you for being hurt by it." Eliza's eyes filled. "He did love you. I hated it, but it was true. He ended things with me the week before your wedding. The letter you found, it was old. From before." "I know," Clara said. "My father used me," Eliza said. "He wanted your husband's land, and he used my feelings to try to get it. And when that failed, he used loans and clauses and dams and poison, and I let him. I let him use me against you because it was easier than standing up to him, and I am not proud of any of it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We have all been somebody's pawn. What matters is what you do when you finally see the board." Eliza looked at her. Something passed between them that was not friendship exactly, but was maybe the beginning of understanding. Then Eliza nodded, mounted her horse, and rode away. Clara watched her go. Then she turned and went inside, where her family was waiting. That evening, the first rain of the season fell on the Quinn ranch. It came without warning, the way good things sometimes do. One moment the sky was clear and dry, and the next, clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and dark, and the smell of rain on dry earth filled the valley like a promise being kept. The first drops hit the tin roof of the porch and made a sound like fingers drumming on a table, tentative at first, then steady, then full. Clara sat on the porch with James, asleep in the cradle Jacob had built. The cradle was simple, made of pine, sanded smooth, with runners that let it rock. Jacob had carved something into the headboard. Clara had not noticed it until after the birth. It said, in rough but careful letters, "Welcome home." Tempest stood untied in the yard. The black mare that no one else could ride was calm and still, nosing at the wet grass, her coal dark coat shining in the rain. She did not run. She did not fight. She stood where she chose to stand, free and unafraid. Jacob came up from the barn. The rain had darkened his shirt and plastered his hair to his forehead, and he was smiling. Not the almost smile that Clara had learned to watch for. A real smile, open and unguarded, and it transformed his face from handsome into something that made her heart hurt in the best possible way. He sat down beside her on the porch. He took her hand. Their fingers intertwined, new calluses against old ones, and they sat there and listened to the rain. The creek was flowing again. Clara could hear it from the porch, the sound of water over stones, steady and clear. The dam was gone. The water was back. The land was drinking it in. Jacob spoke first. That day in the church. "When you told me about the baby and I walked out, you thought I was leaving. I did. I was not. I stepped outside because I wanted to say yes so badly it scared me. I did not think I deserved this. A family, a wife, a child. I thought I would ruin it the way my father ruined everything he touched. And now I think my mother was right. I am not him. I was never him." He paused. "But I did not believe that until you." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. The rain drummed on the tin roof. James made a small sound in his sleep, not a cry, just a murmur, the sound of a baby who knows he is safe. "You owe me something," Clara said. Jacob looked at her. "What?" "At our wedding. You kissed my cheek. Not my mouth. My cheek. Like I was your aunt. You owe me a real kiss, Jacob Quinn." He laughed. It was the laugh she had fallen in love with, rare and warm and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had spent his whole life holding joy at arm's length and had finally let it in. He cupped her face in both hands. His palms were rough and warm and gentle, the same hands that had caught their son, the same hands that had hit a man to protect her, the same hands that had shaken with fear and steadied with love. He tilted her chin up and looked into her eyes, and what she saw in his face was everything, every wall down, every scar visible, every secret known. And underneath it all, love, simple and enormous, and no longer afraid. He kissed her the way he should have kissed her that day in the church, slow and thorough and full of promise. The kind of kiss that says this is not the end of something, but the beginning. The kind of kiss that a woman feels in her bones and remembers when she is old. When they parted, Clara whispered, "We are home." Jacob looked at the baby sleeping in the cradle, at the woman who had ridden a wild horse through the dark to save him, at the land his mother had built from nothing, at the rain falling on ground that everyone said would stay dry forever. "We are home," he said. The rain kept falling. The creek kept running. James slept. Tempest stood in the yard, free and unafraid. And on the Quinn Ranch, in a house built by a woman who never gave up and held together by a man who finally stopped being afraid, the sound of water on the tin roof was the sound of everything that had been dry and broken and hopeless coming back to life. The story of Jacob and Clara Quinn did not begin with love. It began with loss, with debt, with a desperate woman and a lonely man, and a conversation in a church. It began with secrets and scars and a baby that nobody planned for. It began with two people who had every reason to fail, and no reason to trust each other, except the stubborn, unreasonable hope that if they tried hard enough they could build something worth having. And they did. Not because it was easy, not because they were perfect, not because the world was kind. They built it because they chose to. Because Jacob chose to be a father to a child who was not his blood, and Clara chose to trust a man who had given her every reason to doubt, and Red chose to tell the truth despite the cost, and even Eliza chose, in the end, to step out of her father's shadow. Family is not what you are born into. It is what you build when everything else has been taken away. It is a choice you make every morning when you wake up beside someone and decide again to stay, to try, to love them through the hard parts and the good parts, and the parts that do not make any sense. Jacob and Clara Quinn built their home on dry ground in hard country with nothing but their hands and their word and their stubborn, improbable love. And if you were to ride out to that ranch today, past the mesas and the sagebrush and the creek that runs clear and steady through the valley, you would find their names carved into a wooden sign above the gate. Jacob and Clara Quinn. Together, they built this home. Some things are worth more than all the gold in California. Some things are worth more than water in the desert. And one of those things is the family you choose. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.